I was recently I was remembering a time many years ago when I was in Yosemite, and I've shared here before that when I was younger, I dealt with self-esteem issues, and of course that can take a lot of forms. And I remembered a time when I did a particular hike. It was quite challenging. It's goes out. If you know Yosemite, the high country, there's an area called Tuolumne Meadows, and the meadows are up at about 8,400 feet. So it's pretty high altitude meadows. And then from there, I did a hike to a place called Cloud's Rest, and it's a hard hike. It's 7 miles in. I did it in a day, so it was a 14-mile round trip, and it's pretty much uphill the whole way for the whole 7 miles, and you're at altitude, so it's hard. I remember when I reached the top, and it was this just beautiful vista view of, you could just see for many miles in all directions, surrounding mountains, valleys. It was beautiful. And there's something, if you've ever been to places that are quite open and spacious like that, many people find that it can have an opening and a feeling of spaciousness in our hearts and minds just by being in spaces like that. If you ever go to the rim of the Grand Canyon, it has a similar feeling, and a lot of other similar places. And what I was really remembering about that particular hike was I was going through a particularly hard experience. I don't remember at all what it was, but some kind of suffering within myself. And then it really struck me when I was sitting on top of Cloud's Rest how peaceful my mind was. And I wasn't questioning myself, who I was, did I belong, where was my place in life, where was my place in the world, in the universe. You just kind of knew your place, and my mind was at peace. And what I took away from that was, it was so striking for me that I went through a period of time whenever I would get in special places like that. It doesn't have to be on a high mountain, but in places of, especially I'm thinking of being in nature and beauty. And a number of times I would notice that it seemed like whenever I would be in such a place, my mind tended to go into a relaxed, open place of really kind of letting go, non-clinging, equanimity, and the heart opening up in really beautiful ways. And so I want to come back to that, but it made me think as I was reflecting on what to discuss for this evening. If you take Theravada Buddhism, it tends to focus its path towards liberation on the idea of letting go of the self, letting go of everything, really. And they don't talk a lot about sort of letting go into something bigger or what happens, but it's all just about it's more meant to be experienced and not to be talked so much about so much. But actually, there are two sides to the path that I think are important to talk about. And I like the way, if you ever read Jack Kornfield's book, A Path with Heart, it's an older book. I don't know how long, maybe it came out 30 years ago or something. I don't remember, but I'm guessing some of you have read it. It was quite a popular book. And I recommend it. It's a really well done book, and it captures the path and the spirit of the path of Dharma. And he's got a chapter in there, then the title is something like Expanding the Self and Dissolving the Self. And in there he's talking about how I think he was talking about in meditation in particular, that aspect of Dharma practice. But I would just say, and for me, Dharma practice in general, how it can on its own, or we can aim ourselves in a couple of different ways that can feel quite different, but I think both can be useful and helpful at different times in really leading to the same thing. So the idea of expanding the self, of course, that was his choice of words. Um, Here, I don't want to speak of it in so much in terms of expanding the self, but it's another way leading into actually letting go in a deep and profound way of non-clinging. I would say expanding into, it doesn't have to be the self that expands, and I think this is what Jack meant, but really opening into something bigger. So I'll say a little bit about that in just a bit. And then there's another way you can come at it, which is feels kind of the opposite, where it's not expanding into something, but it's more of a letting go. And Jack was talking about it as dissolving away the self. And it can feel like these two ways. But before I say a few words about each of those, it's important to hang out just for a few moments in that in Theravada Buddhism, it tends to, the emphasis tends to be on what is called, so in the old Christian Latin traditions, there's what you might have heard these terms via negativa and via positiva, the way of via positiva, the way of affirmation, and via negativa, the way of negation. And I think the idea would be something like, I want to be careful, and I can't really represent those Christian traditions, but I think what I'm about to say may not be exactly accurate, but I think it will convey the sense. The via positiva, if you're heading toward whatever your highest spiritual truth is, if maybe you're speaking in terms of God, you could say everything that God is in positive terms. And, God could be, all knowing, all powerful, all loving, things like that. That would be the way of affirmation, the via positiva. And the way of negation, the via negativa, would be just stripping away and not assigning things to the higher truth that it's not. And I think the Theravada tends to be more on the via negativa. And so a lot of the emphasis is, and these are not, it's not like one is better than the other. It's which way becomes most alive for each of us as our own pathway, because we're all different, and it's really not just one way. But Theravada definitely in general is making more of a negation or dissolving the self, if you want to speak of it that way, emphasis. And so it's letting go, letting go, letting go. And then the question is, they in the Theravada they speak of what's called the deathless. That's nibbana in Pali or nirvana in Sanskrit. But not much is said about it because it really is beyond verbal conceptual categories. The word is ineffable, if you know that term. It means it can't be described in words. So rather than trying to do it, it's more about letting go of everything that keeps us separated out, and then experientially what is revealed, or what remains. This language is a little clumsy that I'm using, but I'm trying to speak of things that are hard to speak about in words. A lot of this can be experienced, or anyway. So one of the questions is, whatever our view of our spiritual life and our goals is, and that of course varies for all of us, then what is the way leading to it? So in using the terms that I often use, which is attributed to the Buddha, speaking of liberation through non-clinging, what leads to the liberation through non-clinging? Sometimes in the Theravada, because of what I just said, that it is a path that really tends on the letting go and the negation, and that can be held up as a better way. And I think the thinking bit is, if you're kind of expanding into something bigger, then that can be in some ways a clinging or an identity around that bigger whatever. Um, I have found from many people speaking with, talking with, in my own experience that that's not true. That this opening to something more expansive actually is equally as powerful of a way of really just a deep and profound non-clinging as approaching it from more the sense of dissolving the self. And a perfect example is uh, um, what I was talking about on being on the mountaintop. And that was the best I was able to get my hands on. Well, what was really going on, opening up into something broader. And so I bring these in because I want to offer for you to consider as you go, especially during these times that are definitely have a lot of challenges, a lot of unknown, a lot of worry, a lot of uncertainty, and we each have our own degree of how much we're suffering or not. Um, there are things we can do to experiment with to see what might help us open up into more of this place of the liberation of non-clinging given, and it doesn't have to be when we're in a global pandemic. Of course, we have our suffering anytime in life. So what I'm about to say are some experiments you can try anytime. Um, the reason I began thinking about this was a couple of nights ago. I think it was the full moon, 1 or 2 nights ago. And I'm looking out at my window right now. It looks a little cloudy, but it's been quite, the sky's been clear the last few nights, and the moon's been beautiful. And I went outside and spent some time just looking up at the moon and just the whole, the wonder of the heavens and all of that, that I'm sure we've all done many times. And spending some time reflecting, not only, the moon, it's less than 250,000 miles away. It's not that far away, actually. It really isn't very far away. I mean, if you were going to walk it, it's far, but really it's pretty close. And um, so I was reflecting on just the sense of feeling connected. But I also was reflecting that right now, in this moment, while I was not right now speaking with you, but in the moment, how many other people are looking up at the moon at this same moment, just as I am, and having whatever their experience is. And it was probably, millions of people around the world who happen to have the view if it's nighttime for them right now. And in reflecting that way, I felt a great connection with just humanity, with other beings, with all beings, both in that for those of us who are having a shared experience, but somehow it just opened me up to it's hard to explain, but just the interconnection, I guess that's a word that doesn't get talked about much in Theravada, but that was the experience I had with everyone and with life and with nature. And even then it opened up into reflecting, how, I am myself. I'm not someone observing nature or being nature. I am nature. I am part of nature too, in every sense. So it's one example of just something simple, going outside and opening up. It brought more of this expansive feeling. And through that, it didn't really lead to some clinging. It led to a settling and a quieting of my mind and an opening of my heart and just a beautiful presence and connectedness there. And so I offer that to you because it may not be the moon, but if, depending on your own circumstances in your life, to the extent you're able, I recommend that you actively look for ways that in nature, it can be in music, it could be in literature and poetry, it could be just taking a walk down your street and seeing. I was doing this afternoon, going around my neighborhood with my family, and just in my local neighborhood, people are out, and just something simple like that. Wasn't even in nature, just through the residential streets. And, everybody, because it was wonderful because we all felt so connected. Everybody, not everybody, but there were people here and there out. And we all knew, we'd look at each other and kind of nod, and we all knew that we're taking care of each other, right? We're all physically distancing from each other. And we could see that everyone was doing that. And that sort of brought us into a commonality, a connectedness. And just looking down the street and seeing people here and there, we passed one yard, and it looked like there were people having it was just around dinner time, and people were having what looked like to be a physical distancing dinner party. And it was lovely. Again, I don't really know, but it looked like maybe whomever lived in the house, that group of people, family, whatever, had invited another group. But you sort of had the feeling of a different group. But everybody was doing it the right way, so they were being safe. And so, just looking around and seeing us all in this together. Again, that's a simple way, but it was a way to feel connected, and using a more expansive connecting sense to open up. And so simple things can be very, very powerful, but we don't want to invalidate them in any way or diminish their power. I think they can be quite profound. And then we can really stay attuned and feel what actually is the experience. First of all, does this help me feel more expansive? That's my own word. More connected, something beyond myself, bigger than myself. What I find is when I'm able to really get the essence of that, there isn't so much a difference between what Jack was saying, expanding the self or dissolving the self, but that it's just a way of speaking, the expanding or connecting more widely really opens you into the place of deep letting go and non-clinging. So you have to experiment with that yourself and see, but I have found for myself it most definitely can be that way, and it can be a very powerful doorway into, when we again use the phrase liberation through non-clinging. And the doorway can, of course, feel very much the opposite. When we're opening to, it's more, the feeling isn't so expansive. The more feeling is letting go and dissolving away. But even by approaching it that way, sometimes on its own, we open up into places that are quite expansive. And I cannot tell you how many times people have come to me to talk about their meditation practice. And they've actually been practicing and bringing a very traditional Theravada understanding to inform their practice, and practicing in very traditional ways of bringing mindfulness and non-clinging and letting go. No idea about expanding to anything, nothing like that. But then through those practices, it on its own would open up into something very vast and big, and then come like, oh, there's something wrong, or what's going on? I'm not supposed to be doing that. And then, of course, my advice always is, as I've shared here, there's not a supposed to about it. It's like, well, it's more, well, what's actually happening? And yes, depending on what's going on, we all may want times to consciously, purposely steer our practice in another direction. And of course, that's a big conversation depending on what's going on, why we may want to steer it in a different direction, how to do that. And so that's a lot of the nuts and bolts of being wise and skillful in our practice. But the starting point always is just opening to bring a presence with what's actually real and true and happening. And so when that's happening, rather than coming to it with some predetermined view on how it's supposed to be, because maybe we read some ancient text and it didn't speak of it in that particular way, I think we have to stay very open to not be too stuck on fixed approaches or views in the service. We want to be clear on what we mean by liberation through non-clinging. Those are very traditional teachings, and no Buddhists of any stripe would quibble with that. There's no Buddhist teachers out there who say cling, right? So I think everybody would want to sign up in any tradition through letting go of clinging. So in service of that, though, we really have to take a broader view, because we're all so different. And a lot of people have had a lot of suffering in their lives and their practices because of certain fixed ideas on what the form is supposed to look like in service of that. So we want to be careful. We're not. I tend to be. If you know me very well, you'll know. A lot of times people think, well, Richard, you're not that much of a traditionalist, but actually, I kind of my practice for many years comes out of Theravada Buddhism, a particular flavor of Theravada, and I do hold for myself that view of kind of an ultimate aim of Dharma and liberation. You may or may not share that yourself. How that is achieved, though, I am most certainly not a traditionalist, and I've seen enough from experience to know that it's not just one way. And I think any experienced Dharma teacher would approve of that and would be in support of that. That we may teach particular systems, but we have to be open to what's actually most needed and most useful for each of us at any given time. And so if we can keep that open attitude, then we can stay open to however our practice unfolds. And in the broad context of the liberation of our hearts and minds, holding it that way, I really think we don't have to hide away the expanding, using Jack's language, expanding the self side of things. It's not so traditional Theravada language. It really tends to have more of, coming out of some of the yoga traditions out of India, which I did practice in my early years, that tend to really overtly practice and aim in some of those directions. But that's okay. I don't think we have to push that away there. So I offer this side of the expanding the self, or the way I like to say it, opening to an expansiveness. You don't have to put the I am expanding the self. We can use passive voice verbs. I think that'll make the Theravadas be a little happier. But allowing and opening to something greater to happen. And then because our practice is informed through non-clinging, I think those two can come together and inform each other very well. And if that's something you're drawn to, again, it's just a matter of finding what are the ways you can actually do that. So I'm just going to wrap up in the next few minutes. I just want to offer, if you find yourself struggling, stuck in some way with, it depends on your living situation. Maybe, we can have, so many of us, like we're bored, we're lonely, we're depressed. It can happen a lot. We need to be respectful and pay attention to those feelings. Let them inform us so we know what's needed. And if we don't know what's needed, let's take a look and see, can I consciously turn myself towards something that would be more resourcing for me? And one of the ways you can do that is consciously look for the interconnection side, where you can find it. And it could be something like looking at the moon, right? Or just taking a walk down your neighborhood. We have to stay attuned and open, and then really, really connect with, let the feeling of those times come in. So thank you very much. I'll pause there.